Thank you, Mr. Petrom, and I want to continue with Professor Ule. We heard that from one way that it's very difficult to comprehend this relation between science and religion, or God even more. And from on other side, that there is no contradiction, but it seems that this is very paradoxical relation. What do you think?
Yes. First of all, thank you for the invitation to collaborate with my colleagues in this discussion. I hope I will do some good, a few good remarks. I don't know, but let me start. First, I would say that there are two things. If we compare so-called normal science and so-called normal religion, then they go their separate ways, and normally they don't overlap. What do I mean by normal science and normal religion? Normal science is a science working within its established paradigm, and doesn't pose any metaphysical or borderline questions. That is, it solves puzzles, but not problems, in common sense. And formal religion is a religion rooted in the established theology, liturgy, and form of speech and conduct. However, science of scientific revolution, the so-called extraordinary science in the Kuhnian sense, and also the extraordinary existential religion could overlap, but in a positive or in a negative way. There are examples when it was precisely the religiosity of a given scientist that led him to his most important discoveries. And there are opposite cases where a scientist decided to leave his religious tradition due to his scientific views. Naturally, it happens also vice versa. In this sense, God in normal science is a hypothesis that is not needed. But in extraordinary science can be very helpful. Can be.
And the same question about this relation for Professor Vušić.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you to you all for coming in such a large number here. And good afternoon to all, especially to our guest, Professor Lennox. Well, let's say my first answer, because after the first answer there are many other answers, to the main question, to the first question, does modern science lead to God, would be no, period. Of course, after this period there are many other sentences and thoughts to tell and to think. At least it doesn't lead to God in the sense of theistic religion, God in the theistic sense. I mean, science, also modern science with Big Bang and with quantum physics and with entropic principle and with fine-tuning and so on, these are topics which I'm most interested in as a philosopher of nature, doesn't lead to my mind, it doesn't lead to God in the sense of the creator of the world, in a sense of a person, in a sense of a person with will and mind, and maybe also compassion for us human beings. Well, the question of compatibility between religion and science, of course they are compatible, why not? They don't, I'm also sure that they don't hinder each other. Belief in God, well, itself, the belief itself, not the, let's say, institutions and history and so on, belief in God does not hinder scientific activity, I agree. But here the question is of course of two, let's say, languages, as Professor Emri said before. The language of religion is different than the language of science. To my mind, the science, well, I wouldn't use the term normal science because I'm not quite sure what would it mean, as my colleague Andrej said, normal science, but the science itself as a as a theory, as doing theoretical models, it doesn't need this hypothesis. Still, it doesn't need, as it didn't need in the time of Pierre-Simon de Laplace. But another question is, of course, the interpretation of science. Several interpretations of science. I know that this relation between models and interpretation of models is very complicated, and we can discuss it. But generally speaking, well, we have science itself is model making and verification or falsification of these models. For example, Big Bang. Big Bang, the famous, let's say, standard cosmological model, which has been developing with several additions from the 20s in the previous century, nearly 100 years. That's actually a mathematical physical theory kind of model, which is our best model. But now, theistic inclined people can say it confirms, in a sense, the God, the Creator. I'm afraid it's not so simple. Also, the Georges Lemaitre, for example, who was one of the pioneers in the field, was himself a priest, was not so convinced that this is an argument for God the Creator. And from this point, I quite agree with Stephen Hawking that, well, science cannot lead to some answer concerning God. Well, maybe he's a little too inclined, Stephen Hawking, to answer it negatively. I admit that. And especially Richardom Dawkinsom, for example, that is an author which I absolutely don't like in this sense. Well, another thing is he is a biologist and so on, but the book God as Illusion is, to my mind, very simple-minded. But look, compatibility, science and religion. Well, do we ask ourselves, are, for example, mathematics and art compatible? Of course they are. Why not? That's a similar question. We do as people who try to be holistic, let's say, or integral human beings, and so we do mathematics as well as art. And the question if whether mathematics and art are compatible, well, I don't remember that I heard this question was put. But it's a kind of similar question. They have, of course, for example, the art could have some mathematical, let's say, expression means and so on. And on the other hand, mathematics itself is a kind of art and so on. But they are two different languages. And from this point, I think it's the questions that I think the second circle of our discussion, or the third or the fourth, which are the common questions of these two fields, because we have to make it more special. Probably what is actually, what could be the questions of discussion between theology and let's say cosmology or science. Thank you.
Professor Lennox, you want to continue?
Well, this is all fascinating, gentlemen. I wonder, is it helpful? Well, several people have used the notion of two languages. And I think one of the things that's at stake here is the nature of explanation. What do we mean by an explanation? Now, let me give you a very simple example of that. If we had a Ford motor car here, and I said to you, look, I can explain this in terms of a law, the law of internal combustion, and engineering, mechanical engineering. That's one scientific, if you like, explanation. But there's another explanation, and that is Henry Ford. And he is an explanation in terms of a personal agent. Now, it's obvious to all of us that those two levels of explanation, A, are necessary for a holistic description of the motor car, B, they do not conflict, they do not compete, but they complement one another. And just as mathematics and art, and we could take history and all the other disciplines, are different languages, we can apply aspects of each of those languages to the very same phenomenon. And to my mind, the problem of reductionism, and we're going to come to that, I think, is to limit to one level of explanation. So, when we're faced with the question, do God and science compete? The answer is, of course, not, because they're not the same kind of explanation. And I would apply that as well to Laplace, who's just been mentioned. When Laplace was asked by Napoleon, where is God in your equations? And Laplace replied, je n'ai pas besoin de cette hypothèse, I don't need that hypothesis. He was absolutely right. Because if the question is, how do missiles move under gravity? God doesn't come up with the answer. I don't use God when I'm explaining those equations in the mathematics department at Oxford. But if the question had been, Mr. Laplace, how is it possible that the universe exists which is describable by your mathematical equations? The answer might have been different. It depends on what question you're asking. And it seems to me, therefore, that the God question makes perfect sense at what we call the meta level. And when I would want to say that science points towards God, I would say not in the sense that you get a mathematical proof of God, but for me, the very fact that we can do mathematics, the very fact that we can have a scientific description of things is a pointer. Now this may be something you want to discuss a little bit later, because when we meet discussing a topic like this, I sense there's a sense in which, I'm fascinated by the agreement we have up here, that science and religion don't compete, and yet people sense there's a conflict somewhere. May I suggest that the conflict is not, in the first instance, between science and perhaps we should say theology if we want to make the parallel correct, because they're both disciplines. But the conflict is between worldviews. The worldview of naturalism on the one side and the worldview of theism on the other. And the interesting thing is, what substantiates my feeling that that is where the real problem lies, is the fact that there are brilliant scientists on both sides. Peter Higgs has just won the Nobel Prize. He's a physicist. William Phillips won the Nobel Prize a few years ago. So they're both Nobel Prize winners. But one is a Christian and the other is an atheist. So what distinguishes them is not their science, nor their commitment to science. It's their worldview. So I think the real question is actually, granted that that is the case, does science point to any particular worldview or not? Where does it sit? It's not a warfare between science and religion.